welcome you all back to this month's Neurohumanities Network gathering. I'm Galina Gakeman, and I'm just going to start off with a quick few welcome slides to remind you about our network and what you can look forward to today and in the coming days. So welcome again to the Neurohumanities Network. We're really a group of individuals who are interested in exploring the intersections between arts, the humanities, and the neurosciences, and we really think everyone is welcome in this conversation. So we're so excited that many of you could join us tonight. Who we are, we were a group started by a number of trainees in neurology, some of us in medical school, some residents, fellows, some attendings now, and really had this idea of bringing folks together to have these conversations. My colleagues and I, who are leading, are listed here on the slides, and we also want to acknowledge and support the Arts and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School, who provided some of the initial funds to help get us started. We want you to stay connected with us. The first way is, of course, being part of our monthly virtual seminars as you've joined tonight. We also have a newsletter with emails that keep you up to date on our upcoming events. We have a YouTube channel where we're sharing these lectures, including tonight's, a website's in development to continue to have a chance for you to interact with us and look at our archived content, and of course, engaging with us on social media. Thanks to our wonderful medical student team for running our X and Instagram accounts. And excitingly, we're having booster sessions or practicums for a chance for you to actually put the arts and humanities into practice. We had our first this month with a movement and dance class, and we hope to bring other booster sessions to you down the line. Our first Neurohumanities Network contest results was exciting to announce. We are so excited that many of you contributed your artwork for our reimagining the cookie theft scene for in the period of Halloween. We want to congratulate our winner, Danya Gori, for her contribution of Mind Your Neuron Business. But we wanted to thank all those who participated. We had wonderful submissions, and this couldn't have been done without the votes that came in over Halloween's night to select our winner. So the gift cards, in the mail over to Danya, and we congratulate her for contributing, and keep your eyes peeled for future contests down the line. But with no further ado, I want to move things over into tonight's session, which I'm incredibly excited to introduce and announce. And that is going to be our lecture tonight by none other than Dr. Edison Miyawaki, who's going to speak to us about reading and neurology. And I just want to take a few moments to tell you a little bit about Dr. Miyawaki. So Edison Miyawaki is an associate neurologist at Mass General Brigham and an assistant professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. These are both in Boston in the US. He trained in both neurology and psychiatry at Harvard teaching hospitals. He has practiced academic neurology for over 35 years, has published over 100 articles or presentations in print and other media, including 10 books on neurology and psychiatry. Subjects of those books include Sigmund Freud's Psychology of Love and Human and Vertebrate Neuroanatomy. Regarding the latter topic, he has written 9 books, among them the Autumn Brain Seminars in 2 volumes. He's written about neurosciences for general audiences in periodicals including The American Scholar, The Atlantic, and the Yale Review, relevant to today's talk. This talk is going to be entitled Reading in Neurology. We'll summarize his interest in the subject, not just interest, but as you can tell, expertise, dating to his undergraduate and graduate study of literature at Yale University. And I have to credit Dr. Miyawaki. I don't know everything he knows, but everything I know, he taught me. So with that, I'll pass it along to Dr. Miyawaki. Thank you for being with us tonight.
That's incredibly kind. Thank you so much. As you heard, my name is Ed Miyawaki, and the title of this talk is Reading and Neurology. And I have 2 comments to make by way of a preface. The first is, there is no way on God's green earth I'm going to go 90 minutes. I know we're scheduled for 90 minutes, but there's no chance that's going to happen. It'll be much shorter than that. That's the first comment. The second comment is that aside from the first slide, this talk is absolutely unapologetically autobiographical. And I'll explain why it's autobiographical after the first slide. So here's the first slide. Uh, the In my inbox over the weekend, as I was prepping this talk, this paper shows up, and I can't tell you the joy that I felt both seeing this title pop up and then reading it. Amongst the authors are some very dear friends, some very new, like the first author, and some very old, people that I've known since training. And a number of centers are represented here and discussed in the paper, and we can talk about the paper in greater detail in the question and answer period. But I think if there's a point to be gathered from this paper, it is that the study of the humanities in the context of training in neurology, it's a thing. And if it's a thing, and here's the rationale behind my autobiographical pitch in this talk, if it's a thing, then it might be of interest to some of you to hear the story of a guy, that would be me, over the course of 50 years, that's 50 years, thinking about reading literature and thinking about its relationship to psychology and the brain. So, thus beginneth the autobiography, if my screen will work. Yeah. So, it'll begin here. This monstrosity, this pseudo-Gothic monstrosity, it really is a scary place, is called Lindsley Chittenden Hall. It's on the corner of a place called the Old Campus in New Haven, Connecticut, at Yale University. And I believe it is still the headquarters of the Yale Department of English. And in 1975, before many of you were born, I arrived there, and my plan was to study English. I was going to study English literature, and this was the headquarters. And so I walked in these doors and said, okay, here I am. I'm going to read literature with you guys. Uh, Being the only son of an Asian father who's rather Lear-like, King Lear-like, we'll be talking about Lear in just a bit. He said, well, you can do this literature thing, but make sure you do your pre-med stuff. That's the really important thing. Make sure you do your pre-med stuff, and then you could do whatever you want to do reading wise, but just make sure you do pre-med. And so I did, and I did okay, and I got through the undergraduate curriculum in English and did okay, enough so that I matriculated to the graduate school program in 1979. A little bit late with the senior essay, I'll admit that, but I did get it done, and I got into the graduate school, and that was in 1979. Now, I was there for 1 year, and let me tell you right now. So again, this is autobiographical, but what I want to share with you are both the glories and the abject failures of this career. And that year in graduate school was an abject failure, and here's why. Because I took 8 courses, and each course required about a 25-page paper. And of those 8 courses, I did not complete papers in 7 of those courses. Just one. I just completed one paper of those 8 courses. And so from these doors, these very doors in 1980, there were other issues in that year of graduate school, which I'll describe in a bit. But out of those doors, I walked out in 1980 with an umbrella in hand because it was a rainy day. And I was basically being kicked out of graduate school because of lack of performance, lack of my ability to write. And I walked out of those doors. I held the umbrella up high and I said, I shall return. But unlike MacArthur, when you say, I shall return in your academic career, the high likelihood is you won't. And in fact, I didn't really. I didn't return to Yale in any academic way. My daughter did. Here she is graduating from Yale after having studied art in 2021. But this picture was, 41 years went by. Obviously, she's 21, graduating from Yale at that point. But 41 years, what happened? What happened over those 41 years after those years as an undergraduate? And that's what I want to describe for you because it has everything to do with the relationship reading and neurology. This picture took me a while to find. I had to go through all these Google archives and stuff like that. But those who are at Yale know that there might be some resemblance to what is now called the Bass Center. But back in the 70s, this place was called Cross Campus Library. It's an underground library with this very 70s like rather Stalinesque architecture. And this is where undergraduates went to do their work. And back then, you could get a cup of coffee for 10 cents out of a machine. So many dimes were spent at this coffee machine in this really disgusting place where you went to get food and some kind of sustenance. And otherwise, you could go into these cubbies. There were cubbies lined up along the edges of the old cross-campus library, and you could close the door. And in the artificial light of those rooms, you could do whatever you had to do. And so it was maybe 1976 or thereabouts, and I find myself in Cross Campus Library, which, by the way, is the undergraduate library. You can go to the main library, what's called Sterling Memorial Library, and you can wander the halls. I did that too a little bit later on, but as an undergraduate, 1976 or so, I find myself in a cubby, and I decide that I'm going to sit down, and in one afternoon or however long it took, I'm going to read this thing, which I had never read before. This is King Lear by Shakespeare, of course. And if not read it, that's okay. You'll see a little bit about Lear a little bit later. But what I want to share with you is the experience of reading this thing in that cubby at Cross Campus Library as an undergraduate at Yale in 1966. Elizabethan English is hard to read. There's just no getting around it. And it's you have to check all the notes and all that. But I'm reading it and I'm saying I'm enjoying this. And I get to Act 4. It's in Act 4, not at the very end, not in Act 5, but in Act 4, I am sobbing, sobbing. And this had never quite happened to me before. Now, I've had the experience, I think everybody has, of going to a movie and it's a tearjerker and tears indeed get jerked out of you. But this was new. To read something that was difficult to read because it was Elizabethan English, and to get to Act 4, not even the ending where everybody dies because it's a Shakespearean tragedy, but you get to Act 4 and you're already in Psalms of tears. There was real water power going on there. And I was amazed by it. And I still am fascinated by that. How is it that the experience of text can give rise to an emotive response of such nature? Now, it's hard to describe exactly the environment that was there at Yale in the 1970s and early 80s while I was there. And I want to give you a taste of that with just a couple of slides. This is a book by a man who I started to read very actively in the late 70s. His name is Jeffrey Hartman. He's no longer with us, unfortunately. And the point of showing you this picture, which is the book that I read as an undergraduate, it's not a book of Wordsworth's poetry. He was a poet, an English poet, who wrote basically from the time of the French Revolution up until the fall of Napoleon. Not that that matters. I just want to give you a sense of historical context. It was not a book of Wordsworth's poetry, but rather a book about his poetry. And that was unusual for me. I had not quite seen literary criticism of this proportion. And the idea that one guy would sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write a book about a canon of poetry, to me was a new thing. And it was quite striking to me, and I enjoyed doing it. I liked reading literary criticism. And in fact, I learned a lot of my poetry through reading literary criticism. One more picture to give you a sense of the environment of that time in the late 1970s at Yale College, Yale University. This is actually a picture of the book that I was using at that time when I was attending a seminar by a psychoanalyst by the name of Locke. He was French. He lectured in French. He wrote in French. This is a translation. And what you're seeing here, all this scribble, is something you don't see anymore. This is a fountain pen with a very small nib. That's me. I'm scribbling overall. I'm writing assiduously in a conference regarding this essay entitled "The Insistence of the Letter in the Unconscious." And the concept of insistence of the letter, of the word in the unconscious, is something that we'll come back to, and indeed we'll come back a bit to psychoanalysis, because I later wrote a book on Freud that I'll tell you all about in just a bit. All right, so you have the sense that there are people who um, would write books about poetry, and then there are people talking about psychoanalysis. Right across from Lindsay Chittenden Hall, there was a hall dedicated to philosophy, and you could read Kant and Hegel and all these people. And I was so excited by this. And so I was very eager to go on to the graduate school. And then I ran into some roadblocks that contributed to my absolutely egregious performance. This is a title page from a Latin text called, or written by, the Venerable Bede. Now, Bede is his last name. His first name is not Venerable. I don't know what his first name is. The reason why I show you this title page is because I was told within the first few months of graduate school, oh, by the way, you can translate Latin, right? And I shrugged, and I show the Bede because they always chose Bede for you to translate. So I said, well, maybe I can get by reading some Bede and just knowing sort of where I can get by. And then the next question came up, and we assume that you can translate Greek, right? And I remember this meeting distinctly. I said, okay, do you mean Attic Greek or Homeric Greek? And they said, well, I assume both. And I said, you don't get the joke. I don't translate Greek at all. I can't translate Latin, and I can't Greek. You expect me to do that to get past my first year of graduate school? That's not going to happen. And in addition to that, you had to have one modern European language. I could do that. But all of this represented an impediment. The idea that I had to write these long papers and translate some Latin and translate some Greek just meant that maybe what I'll do for this graduate year is I'll just read a lot. And that's exactly what I did. So I took a course on the Victorian novel. And let me tell you, when you take a course on the Victorian novel, you got some big books to read. A lot of Hardy, George Eliot. I mean, you're reading a lot of stuff. You're reading authors that people don't read uh, quite anymore. John Dryden, you're reading a lot of Milton, you're reading Spencer, you're reading Blake, you're reading Wordsworth, you're reading Shelley, Keats, etc. And I loved it. I loved all that. And that's what reading was all about, this complete immersion in text. But I did not pass my Latin exam. I did not even try the Greek examination. And I went to my mentor at the time there. I had met him as an undergraduate. And let me get that arrow out of the way there. This is, I wish I had taken this picture myself, but I did not. It's a gallery picture from the internet. His name is Harold Bloom, and he's sitting at his dining table, which was never, in my experience, a dining table. It was always where he wrote, and he always sat at that end of the table. And he and his lovely wife, Jean, would have me in their home on Linden Street, and we would sit there and talk about things, sometimes literature, sometimes not. And those were some of my fondest memories. To have a mentor like him was extraordinary. And it had to do mainly with um, the eloquence that he had. We lost him a few years ago, much to my lamentation. The point of this picture, though, is he's making a point. Whenever the finger came up like that, he was going to make a point. And I was telling him that I was an abject failure as an English graduate student, that I had done my homework in terms of reading, to be sure, but I seemed to have suffered from some kind of terrible writer's block, and I just wasn't able to write much. And so Harold holds up his finger. Jean was in the background, as she often was in the kitchen, and Jean is actually on this Zoom thing, which is, I thought about having her join us today because I have such fond memories of this very room. But anyway, Harold's making a point. And he said to me in something, a quotation that I've never forgotten from ancient Hebrew text called The Sayings of the Fathers. He said to me, with regard to your what you call your failure in the graduate school, I only want to remind you of what you know so well, and that is, I didn't know this well, but he said this to me. He said, quote, "You need not complete your work, but nor may you desist from it." Uh, so powerful is that I'm going to say it again. You need not complete your work, but nor may you desist from it. And somehow this gave me the latitude to leave Yale graduate school and to enter the next phase. So I walked out of those doors and I said, I'll come back, but I didn't. I ended up going to medical school. Now, one habit that continued from my undergraduate reading days, I liked books that were written basically by one or two people and heard one voice throughout the entire book. Now, as it turns out, I didn't know this at the time, but both Stan Robbins and Ramsey Cotran were Brigham people, and that's where I ended up being and attending. I didn't know that at the time that I read this book, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed listening to one voice, and Stan Robbins wrote the very first version of this, but Ramsey Cotran came on board and really wrote the bulk of this 800-page book. And I read every single page of it between the end of the first year of medical school, which was horrible. It's horrible mainly because you smell like formaldehyde for 1 year. And then the summer came, and I was on the west side of New York, and I just said, okay, I'll read 60 pages of this thing every day, and I'm going to finish the whole book before I start my second year. And I did. I was very proud of that. And there are very few examples of textbooks in medicine in which there's one person or two people who really write the whole thing. Some examples would be Adams and Victor for Principles of Neurology. Eugene Braunwald wrote Heart Disease. Tony Amato, if you recognize the name, he's on the faculty with us at the Brigham, wrote to neuromuscular disease. Very few examples, really, of a person or a couple of people writing an entire book. But that was my bias. That's the kind of medicine I liked to read. And I did okay in medical school. I got through it. And I ended up thinking about training, and I thought that Boston would be a nice place to go. And so I ended up at this place. Now, you may not recognize this place. This is actually down the street from the Brigham. And I chose purposefully a picture from a very old time. This is the Palmer Building of the old New England Deaconess Hospital. Now, the Deaconess Hospital has since merged with the Bethesda, and now it goes by a different name. It's got two campuses. But back then, the New England Deaconess Hospital, where I went for my internship in medicine, was a standalone fifth Harvard hospital. It was considered the fifth Harvard hospital. I don't know why it was the fifth as opposed to the sixth or the seventh. I don't know, but it was, and this is one of their buildings that still stands. And I chose this picture because it gives you a sense of the throwback nature of what the New England Deaconess Hospital once was. It was a place for expats. This is a picture from 1963. This is the very first neurology department in Boston that was led by a man by the name of Derek Denny Brown. And he's a story unto himself. I don't want to talk about Derek Denny Brown. I want to talk about this guy. This guy, his name was Simeon. That's not Simeon like the monkey, not Simian, but Simeon, Simeon, Locke, Locke. And Simeon, like Harold, had this eloquence thing. He was preternaturally eloquent. That's a very fancy adjective. What do I mean by that? I mean, it was beyond nature. He could speak extemporaneously in full paragraphs for 20 or 30 minutes, just as Harold could. And these two men, Harold Bloom and Simeon Locke, influenced me tremendously. How was it possible that somebody could read enough, know enough, that they could speak so eloquently on virtually any topic that you engage them in? And Simeon was this man, an expat from the old Boston City Hospital where this picture is from, and there were expats from the Mass General. And I get to meet all these people and get trained by them in internal medicine. To give you a sense of these two people, Locke and Harold, um, you can read for yourself, but just the first sentence. Speculation. This is Simeon talking. Encomium or pejorative. That's how he'd start a paragraph. And you might not necessarily know what it means, but it just sounded good. And I said, oh, okay. And this is actually an advocation for speculation in a book that he wrote about dreams, self-published, by the way. He self-published this book very late in his career after he left being as a full professor from the Harvard Medical School. And here's Harold from the same year. Now, you may not know who Wittgenstein is, but if you happen to be interested in philosophy, I thoroughly recommend that you try reading him because he is all about language and philosophy. And Harold here is also advocating for speculation. Sure, Wittgenstein deprecated Freud's theory by calling it a speculation, not a philosophical venture. But, says Harold, to me, that mode of wonder is the great strength of psychoanalysis. This is actually the preface from the book that I wrote on Freud, and I'll describe that in just a bit. But these are examples, just simple examples of the power of these two guys. All right, so let's fast forward a bit. I get through training. I do the internal medicine year. I train in psychiatry. I train in neurology, all in the area of the deaconess. So at the Brigham, at the Beth Israel, I do all that stuff. At the old Massachusetts Mental Health Center, which way back when was called the Boston Psychopathic Hospital, a name that I think really should be resurrected in some way. But now let's fast forward a bit. So all that training ends in 1992. I've been attending for about 4 years. I'm newly married, and my wife and I take a walk down Berry Street, and just a few blocks down from our place there, we go to a bookstore. I said, I want to go into this bookstore. It no longer exists. And on the fourth floor, there was an aisle where you could go and find books about how to get published in this world. And I bought this book in 1996. Notice 6,000 markets for writers. Surely I could find a market for what I wanted to do. Somebody somewhere would accept something that I wrote. And my intent was to write 7 publishable things just to make up for those 7 courses where I didn't finish those. That was my goal. I was going to publish 7 things. Sure, I'd write the, try to publish in Green Journal Neurology or Annals if I got lucky. Maybe even aspire to the New England Journal of Medicine, but basically, no, what I really wanted to do is write those 7 essays. And so I started submitting to various places with mixed success, a lot of failure, a lot of rejections. You don't get accepted right away. You have editors who hack you all up. I submitted to the American Scholar. I submitted to the Atlantic Monthly and got into those, but it was a tough haul. And here's one of the points that I want to make about these 50 years. I mean, if you really want to study the humanities and all that in relationship to what you're doing in medicine, it ain't easy. And I remember that day distinctly. I think my wife does as well when we were up there trying to figure out how I could make good of my writerly life. Well, enter this man who in 1991 becomes editor of the oldest literary review in the United States. It was the Yale Review. And this man is Sandy McClatchy. Actually, his proper name is J.D. McClatchy, but everybody knew him as Sandy. And I actually knew him from my undergraduate years because he ran a course called Daily Themes. Now, Daily Themes was an undergraduate course that you had to apply for. And so the people who wanted to apply came into this room. There must have been 400 or 500 people in this room. And every single one of them in that room wanted to be the next great American novelist. And Sandy ran that course. And this is long before he became editor at the Yale Review. But you have to understand what kind of figure this man was. He was 6'3" if he was an inch. He was Romanesque. He was a beautiful human specimen, and he was brutal. He was absolutely brutal because in the front row, somebody raised their arm in the midst of this discussion about how do we get into daily themes. The person audaciously raised the arm and said, "If you've been published, will that guarantee you admission to daily themes?" And Sandy McClatchy threw back his head and said, and you have to forgive his French, but I'm quoting him directly. He said, quote, "A lot of shit gets published these days." That's him. I'm not swearing. That's him. And then come to find out, I submit there, and lo and behold, he accepts some of my stuff. So it's I and not only that, not just one, not just seven, but a number of them, 16, 17 papers over 20 years. And then unfortunately, he dies very young. So what I want to do now is share with you some of that writing from this is 2010. And this is a review I wrote. You can access it. It's a book written by Stanislas Dehaene, who does neuroscience at the Collège de France. And his book was called Reading in the Brain. And I like this book. I decided to write when I started to submit these things to periodicals and stuff. I said, okay, I'm a neurologist, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm going to write about neuro issues, but I want one author talking about it, and I'm going to talk about that author if I like him or if I don't like him. And I'm going to explain why I think he's good or that person is not good. That's what I wanted to do in these reviews. And Sandy McClatchy accepted this stuff, much to my astonishment. And unlike the early submissions that I had, they weren't hacked up. Sandy did not touch any of my pieces, with the exception of one adjective in the very first thing that I submitted to him in 1997 or thereabouts. Sandy didn't touch a thing. And I said to Harold, I can't, Sandy's not, he's not touching my, I'm so grateful. And Harold said, well, that's Uncle Sandy. He's not going to do anything if the writing's okay. So anyway, let me talk a little bit about this guy, Stanislas Dehaene, because his work on the reading, on the neuroscience of reading, I think is worthwhile to think about. And I want to share with you a little bit of what he discussed to get to what the original title of this topic of this talk was, The Neuroscience of Reading. But I decided to arrogantly talk about my own life. And I'm going to use this example. I hope you recognize it. These are the first two sentences of a very famous American novel called Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And if you've not read it, that's okay. I just want you to have a sense. This is not from Dehaene. This is me talking about Dehaene. But what he says in this book called Reading in the Brain, think neurologically about what is involved in reading these first two sentences. First of all, in reading it, you're darting back and forth in what are called microsaccades. Now, most of everybody here has some neurological training, so I won't go into what a saccade is, but the eyes are darting back and forth. And the reason why is because you want the fovea to be right on, say, call or see, get it right on the fovea so that you're really looking right at the best part of your vision. And so to accomplish that, saccades need to happen. So Dehaene says, well, that's interesting because maybe that places a physiological constraint on how fast one can read if you have to saccade through all these things. And he goes on this riff in his book about the issue of saccades and reading. And so I started to think about it and write about it in that essay that I showed you. You can slow down the saccadic process and increase the amount of time it takes to get through those two sentences just by putting spaces between each letter. So I think that you will agree with me that because I just changed the whole font here and just put spaces between each individual letter, the saccades take longer and it takes you longer to read that passage. And in fact, I would argue further that your comprehension of what those two sentences say is compromised. And I thought that was interesting. And then you can flip the argument. You can say, okay, what if I go to a program which is available? This is going to be a video off of my own computer. I just sat there and took a video. There are software programs that will keep a word on your fovea, if you will, and absent yourself from the felicity of having to saccade between all the words and letters. And so here we go. Let's see how fast you can read. Now you can set that at different paces. I set that at 400 words a minute, and you can go higher. So I said I'd love to read faster. So I set it at 700 just to see what it was like. I'm not going to show you that video because it's a little dizzy making. But the issue is, as I thought about this more and more as a neurologist, I said I'm not sure that that's all that reading entails. And I want to share with you some aspects of that. So if we look at other languages, is it true, for example, that it requires extra saccades to get through, say, for example, Japanese ideograms? Now, in modern Japanese, it's very common to read from left to right. In traditional Japanese, of course, it's much more common to see texts going from right to left, as is true in Arabic. And the lower version is also a translation of the first two sentences of Melville in Arabic as opposed to Japanese. But what I'm going to suggest to you is that no, saccades aren't in play. There's something else in reading, in the neurology of reading, that's involved. So, say, for example, if I were not a fluent reader of Japanese, I'm not, but I can read some. I think I could use some of the punctuations and get a sense that that little stuff in green relates to that pause in that second sentence where he says, "Never mind how long." And I could start to deconstruct these things, even if I don't even know the language, right? And certainly I don't read Arabic. So the issue is, can you do that in a way that doesn't involve saccades? Is reading much more than the generation of saccades to see things? So I started to really think about this. And I started to think about what if you just don't put spaces at all? What happens if that happens? So here's the same two sentences, call me Ishmael, etc. Come to find out, I had to do some reading on this after reading to end. The punctuation didn't show up right away. The written word shows up before 300 BC. And in 300 BC, yes, there was some punctuation, but punctuation doesn't really show up for another 1,000 years. So a lot of these things that you see in vellum, for example, the handwritten things on vellum, there's no punctuation. So when people read back then, what they would do to make sense of this gibberish is they would whisper to themselves when they read, "So call me Ishmael, some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no, et cetera, et cetera." And this to me gave me a sense that when we read, there is something aside from just saccades to get from point A to point B. Something else is involved in the mental processing. Now, Dehen runs with this idea. And he says, oh, okay, if we think about just vertebrate vision in general, what actually do animals see? What does a bird see at about 6 feet in altitude as it approaches a tree? And he discusses science that was done at Caltech, and they took samples of all these pictures, nature pictures, and so I did the same thing. I went into my backyard and I said to myself, I asked myself, what does the bird see? Does the bird see an E? Does it see a V? Does it see some T's in the margins? I don't speak bird, so I don't know what the bird actually sees, but is it in fact not a saccade between different branches, but sort of a gestalt? That's a loaded term, but such a thing as gestalt psychology, and I'm not talking about that. Is there an impression of the whole that comes out as a function of reading, and is that not part of what we call reading? Well, I think so. I really do. So if you take different versions of that first line, that first sentence of Melville, you can look at all these different versions of it and still say, I get the point of the first sentence. The guy's name is Ishmael. So too, if you look at the same word in different kinds of fonts with caps and low, non-caps and all that kind of stuff, you know that you're talking about a radio. That's the signification of that word. And it made me think that there is something that I would call, or I was thinking about when I was writing that thing on Dehen. Are there things that are invariant, despite the way that the words are presented to you as a reader? And I this, and again, this is largely influenced by Dehaene. I want to try to prove this point to you by a couple of examples. All of us know the Mona Lisa, right? You can picture it in your mind's eye right now. So I'm going to ask you point blank, and please don't answer out loud. You can answer it later in the Q&A session, but which way does the Mona Lisa face? Does she face to the left? Does she face to the right? Or does she face straight ahead? And you may not be sure. So here she is. And it's actually there's the answers that I provide are inadequate because she's turned slightly to her right, her torso is, but her head is turned slightly to the left. But we know that it's the Mona Lisa. Of course we know it's the Mona Lisa. Like any kind of representation otherwise, a bad reproduction, what Andy Warhol did with the image, you know that's the Mona Lisa. There's some invariant aspect of the representation that holds true across different variations of that text, if you will, in this case, a painting. So here's another example of it. Which way does George Washington face? But the question is not specific enough because are you talking about him on the dollar bill? Are you talking about him on the quarter? And so let me give you both examples. Here he is on the dollar bill to the left, and you'll notice that the body is turned in exactly the opposite way from the Mona Lisa, but we know that's George. Absolutely, we know that's George. And we also know, even on a faced coin, which is why I chose the coin from 1935, all the details may be effaced because this coin has been rubbed out, but you know it's George. There's something invariant about the concept of George Washington in our head. It's like a meme. It is independent of our ability to saccade between his left eye and his right eye. There is something that is invariant across these representations. And I thought this was a very interesting idea, and I wanted to think more about it, and I did. And I wrote a book about it. So this book got some press. It was called What to Read on Love, Not Sex. I'll describe it a bit. And it got some press, and I'm very grateful for it. It was a book basically about Freud's psychology of love. Now, I have some very brutal friends. They saw this when it came out in the Gazette. A very nice woman by the name of Sarah Sweeney interviewed me about the book that I wrote, came out in 2012. But my friends are brutal, absolutely brutal. And they said, Miyawaki, congratulations. Glad to hear about your press and all that, your book and all that. But what's with that picture? Looks like you're getting a prostate check and you're enjoying it. I mean, it was a very, it's tough to have your friends be brutal like that. And what's sad about this publicity is that my attempt was not really to talk about love, what I thought love was, but rather to try to explain what happened to me at Cross Campus in 1976. I thought that I could write a book using Freud as my premise, that certain fictions, certain stories, certain texts, certain pictures could speak to us with what I called a strange and powerful veracity. And I was trying to get at the point that the stories, whether or not you're familiar with them, had some invariant quality, and that Freud was picking up on this to utilize in his theory of mind. So let me give you some from Freud and from the book. We all know about the so-called Oedipus complex. This is a red figure vase that shows Oedipus being interrogated by the Sphinx. Everybody knows about the question that the Sphinx asks to Oedipus, what walks on four legs, then two, then three? And the answer is man or me, Oedipus. And what Freud does is he makes this into a corroboration of a complex that he described. Now, if you really want to understand Oedipus, I suggest not reading Freud, but rather reading Sophocles. Because to understand who Oedipus was and why the questioning was so profound by the Sphinx and what he meant to the city of Thebes where he was king, it means that you read not just Oedipus the king, but the entire trilogy. So that's Oedipus at Colonus, that's Antigone, the story about his daughter. And Freud, I think, did this. And I make the argument that he did, and that he basically usurped what was invariant about the idea of Oedipus and incorporated it into his psychology. Just to give you a taste of this, this is just a translation I found in his encounter with the Sphinx. Says Oedipus, I came, Know nothing Oedipus. I stopped the Sphinx by answering the Sphinx's question. Know nothing is profound here because Oedipus and his tragedy has to do with the fact not that he had a passion for his mother and that he wanted to kill his father, but that he didn't know that he had killed his father. He didn't know that he had a mother, and that's the tragedy of the play and the entire trilogy. It's the ignorance of Oedipus. There's this. My book has nothing to do with the psychoanalysis of anything. I'm not looking for phallic symbols. I'm not looking for any of that. I'm thinking about how a man, one guy, uses fiction, something invariant in all the various manifestations of that fiction, to bring home something that is powerful, emotional, and has a certain veracity. He uses myth as well. This is a translation. To really understand the Narcissus myth, you have to do a lot of reading because there are many versions of the Narcissus myth, and I go into all of them. But this is a translation, especially, in which we hear the interplay between Narcissus, this beautiful young person, and a nymph who's in love with him. Her name is Echo. And the gods mandate, this can only happen in myth, by the way. The gods mandate that she can only echo words that are spoken to her. And yet, in this representation, it's a kind of summary, I think, of the quest that we often have uh, to um, to find love in our lives. The questions get answered and not answered, and that kind of communication to me is a kind of invariance that happens across representations. Now, the concept of repetition is, if you've read a lot of literature, it's very common. It happens in Greek tragedy. It goes by a rhetorical form called stichomythia. Shakespeare uses it. Here's an example of it from Shakespeare. And the repetition is not really what I'm drawing attention to. It's the idea that across different kinds of forms of art, you can keep on running into the same kinds of truth. That's the reason why I chose this picture for the cover of my book, because this is Da Vinci, and Freud wrote extensively about Da Vinci. And you'll notice that what I'm considering the invariant aspect are the smiles. The smile of Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary in the middle, even the child. And that smile shows up over and over. It shows up in the Mona Lisa. It shows up in that portrait. It shows up in a late painting of John the Baptist. And most recently, it shows up in the Spiritus Mundi. I'm sorry, I advanced a little fast. But it shows up in the latest supposed Da Vinci, the Spiritus Mundi, the same smile. Freud was also fascinated because he was Jewish in the story of Moses and what he considered to be invariant in the story of Moses. He makes up a crazy story about the origin of Moses. He was especially fascinated by this statue of Moses by Michelangelo, wrote a long essay about it. Freud was obsessed, I think, by not only his theory, which I think a lot of people justifiably think is just flat out wrong now, but what I think is enduring in Freud is the idea of how he uses fiction in its invariant aspects to come at psychological truth. And I think there's something to be said about how we use our reading and think about neurology and how the brain works. I have just three more slides, actually two videos and one summary slide left. And I want to get back to the thing that I started with at Yale in 1976, sitting in one of the lobbies. What was it about Lear in the fourth act that got to me? And so here is a grainy video clip from a 1984 production starring Sir Laurence Olivier as Lear and a woman by the name of Anna Calder Marshall as his daughter, Cordelia. And by way of introduction, if you've not read Lear, it's the story of the relationship between a father and his children, and particularly his youngest daughter, who is Cordelia. I'll not go into the details because what I really want you to get out of these two videos is the interaction between a doddering king who is insufferably arrogant and the one person in his life, aside from maybe Kent in the play, who has deep, abiding, uh, and incredibly truthful love for the man.
Do you? This fittest. My royal lord. Affairs, your majesty. You do me wrong to wake me out of the grave. Oh, what a soul in bliss. But I am bound upon a wheel of fire that mine own tears do scald like molten lead. Do you know me? Mm. No. When did you die?
So that's a late scene in Act 4. And I'll tell you, I remember it clearly. That's when the tears started to flow because of that line, "Sir, do you know me?" Of course, Lear's mad at this point. He has suffered the rage of the tempest, the storm with his fool. And this is a reconciliation, if you will, after Lear has disowned his own best daughter, and after the other daughters completely alienate him, and the madness ensues. But then we have this.
Mightily abused. I did not swear. These are my hands. Would I were assured of my condition.
Oh, look upon me, sir, and raise your hands in benediction on me. Sir, you must not kneel.
Do not love me. I'm very foolish, fond, old man, fourscore and upwards, not a day more nor less. And I do fear I am not in my perfect mind. Methinks I should know you and know this man. Yet I am doubtful. Do not laugh at me, for I do think this lady to be my child, Cordelia.
So I am. I
Do your tears wet? Ah, yes. Say, I pray, weep not. If you have poison for me, I will drink it. I know you do not love me, for your sisters have, as I do remember, done me wrong. You have some cause, they have not.
no cause, no cause.
Am I? In France? In your own kingdom, sir. Oh, do not abuse me.
Okay, well, I got to tell you, that kills me. It just does. It still does 50 years later. So does the story end this biographical thing that I've done to you? Does it end in 2012 with the publication of that book? Well, of course not. It's now 12 years later, and there's been more. There are some books. Most of them are short. But I really turned to thinking about just good old anatomy. I like anatomy. Anatomy is easy compared to reading Shakespeare, in my humble opinion. Um, Let me summarize my talk. It was called Reading in Neurology, and the point to be gathered from this talk is not that you should read neurology. No, of course we're going to read neurology because we're neurologists, so we're going to read a lot of neurology. But I think that a career in reading will eventually find its way into a career in writing. And it took a long time for me. But if you're going to do it, I have some recommendations for you. Actually, just one that I'll repeat twice. And this is true if you're going to be an academic neurologist as well. You have to have something to say. Now, it may or may not be unique, but you have to have something to say and know what you want to say. And then you have to write it. So I already said that again, but that's a really important point. Because if you don't have that passion, then you will not survive the slings and arrows of what happens to you when you do submit. Think about the delay in peer review. Think about the editors who hack you up. Think about the rejections. Think about the pieces that you wrote and agonized over that are not even responded to by editors. All these things happen. And let me add one other thing. When I was doing all that stuff for the Yale Review, and even when I wrote the Freud book and all that stuff, my chief at the time, again, alas, he too has passed, said, you know, it's not going to get you anywhere. Harvard doesn't care about that kind of stuff. What is why do you write so much for the Yale Review? What was that all about? It's not going to get you anywhere. And I made the decision at that time that it didn't matter. I wasn't writing it for academic advancement. What I had to say, which took me so long to find out what I wanted to say, had nothing to do with becoming a full professor at the medical school that I love. So it's important. Academic event, of course it's important, but it's not that important. It's much, much more important are the third and fourth points. And one is the repetition of the other. And so you have to have something to say, and then you have to write it. And then you have to rethink. Is that really what I want to say? And I suppose the last bit of wisdom is not mine, but from my professor, my true earliest and first and dearest professor, now passed, that you need not, at the end of the day, complete your work, but nor may you, at any time, desist from it. Thank you so much for your time.
And that was absolutely marvelous. What a journey. And thanks so much for leading us through your own story. And I'll open the Q&A, but I'll start off by asking you something that I think was really important in this talk, which is almost the idea of the N of one. You know, you told us your own personal story. You told us medical writers who write their own textbook in their own personal voice. And then, of course, you told us about the stories and the plays that Shakespeare wrote and Sophocles and Lacan, and all of these had their own personal view um, toward the readership and toward writing. Now, a question I have for you is that we live in an age where the N of one is really suffering. And I think it's so important, especially for the field of neurohumanities and the humanities as a whole, but also for medicine. What do you think the future is for the N of one, the personal stories?
Let me tell you a story. A person I didn't talk about, who also influenced me tremendously, aside from Simeon Locke, who was a neurologist, by the way, is a man by the name of David Marsden. He was a neurologist at Queen Square, and he too was this preternaturally eloquent human being. And we were having a chat once. He took a drink from time to time, and so we were sitting at a bar, and he was talking about a paper that was submitted to Brain, and it was an N of one paper. It was a case report, and he showed me the paper, and I said, "Well, it's a case report. Does Brain, you know, one of the greatest journals in our field, does Brain publish basically an N of one paper?" And he says, "This is not a case. This is David at his best." He said, "This is not a case. It's the case." So I think it really is a function of, no, of course, if you just write case reports for your career, you're going to have a rough time of it, almost as hard as writing in the sphere of the neurohumanities. But I believe in the N of one. I believe in people who can remember what they need to know about myasthenia, for example, from having seen one case of myasthenia. Excuse me, I believe in it fundamentally. Unfortunately, that's not where we are in our field. But I think that doesn't mandate that you have to think that way yourself. I think in our own clinical experience, all I need is one case, and I can remember if I remember its details well. If my memory is not flagging because of dementia in my old age, I can rely on a case to get me through all the other iterations. Why? Because I think there are some invariant aspects. Gets back to that whole issue of invariance. That there's something about a case that's the gist of it, the essence of it, not a case, but the case. And when you start thinking like that yourself, I think you become a better doctor in general. When the very first time that you hear that S3 as a medical student, you know what the sound of heart failure is. I know that we don't listen to a lot of hearts as neurologists, but I still love that. And Brownwell would talk about this in that one book that he wrote, N of one author, Gene Brownwell, who's also a Brigham doctor, the Brownwell Tower named after him at our hospital. I feel very strongly about this because it does not take more than one case, no matter how much you read. And I'm not sure necessarily that having an N of 1,000 helps you all that much more. I'll give you an example of that. The famous Journal of Neurophysiology paper that has 1,000 young people that provide the basis for the default network state in functional imaging. That's 1,000, N of 1,000. Uh, that should be powerful. I don't know what my resting state looks like. I think my resting state in functional imaging would look different 20 years ago than it is right this very moment. I think the N of one is profound, but I'm distinctly in the minority. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And you know, the I think of the N of one also in terms of literature. Like for instance, when Proust talks about his own experiences or the experience of his characters, or Pessoa talks about his own perceptions. Like that's such a rich way to describe human experience in the field of literature, of course. But
Well, Proust and I have an issue with each other, I think. I'm still trying to get through that book in English. Never mind trying it in French. I am three-quarters the way through. It's taken me, this is just one time around. I just wanted to get through the whole thing just in one thing, and I haven't gotten there yet. I struggle with Marcel because, as was pointed out to him when he submitted Swan's Way to his publisher, the publisher said, "Well, obviously, Marcel, it's a piece of genius, but you just spent 50 pages describing turning over in bed." And I think, but Proust is a perfect example of really the power of one's eye. I don't know Pessoa as well, but Proust I certainly know because I've tried so hard over so many years, and it depends on the translation that you read, of course, since my French is simply not good enough to read it in the original. But Proust is a very good example of that. I think Melville is another good example of it. I think Eliot is a great example of that in the Victorian field. I think in poems, for me, in the modern genre, Wallace Stevens is the person who does it for me under the influence of Harold, of course, Harold Bloom. And I could talk to you at length about these things and what they mean to me and why these things still have power for me. And I do believe that it comes down to, again, a perspective that's provided with novel language, poetical language, that is compellingly singular. In the same way that I was attracted so much to the eloquence of a Harold Bloom, or the eloquence of a Simeon Locke, or an eloquence of a David Marsden, and the people that I've had the good fortune of being in company with.
yeah, that's just wonderful. Um, well, let me open the floor. Do we have any questions? There were some comments during the talk about
Were there? Okay.
yeah, some other books that were single author. Guyton was mentioned.
Oh, hold.
Robbie.
There's lots of stuff here. All right, so let me try and answer. Of course, Guyton. I read the Guyton's book. That's a beautiful. That was a paperback when I was in medical school. Great example of another single author physiology textbook. Robbins' textbook of pathology was written entirely by Robbins himself. It was a delightful read too. I agree. Actually, I looked at that. This is Dr. Newmark writing. Stan Robbins is a very nice guy. By the way, his son actually works in our department, Galina. I didn't know if you knew that. But Stan Robbins was a very great human being. I didn't know him personally. Ramsey Kotran, though, was a force of nature, and I think that concept of one writer is incredible. I'm unable to follow what they used to do when they had no punctuations. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't go into that in sufficient detail. There's a beautiful book on the history of reading. I'm blanking on the guy's name right now. But he describes the encounter of somebody actually reading a text without punctuation. And I believe he was reading St. Augustine. And the experience was that the way you got through reading without punctuation is precisely that you would read to yourself. And so the description is a guy shows up in this scholarly closet, and the guy's muttering to himself as he's reading this text without punctuation, and the visitor feels as though he's interrupting a conversation that's going on between the book and the person. So the idea of punctuation is it doesn't really show up regularly until about 700 AD, according to my reading. Dr. Newmark again saying, I also presented patients to Dr. Simeon Locke when I was a resident. He was memorable. After one patient presentation, we left to go to the ward and see the patient, and I noticed that Dr. Locke wasn't carrying a black bag. Since I was a senior resident, I offered Dr. Locke, would you like to use my diagnostic equipment? And he said, tapping his head, I have it right here. Yeah, it reminds me of when I got my first stethoscope as a third-year medical student. Gone are the days when you get your stethoscope third year, because now they get it in their first year. And I remember it was sort of a joke, but it was sort of real. I get the stethoscope, it's my Littman, and I'm all happy to get it. And the guy up in front, the guy in the white coat says, and just never forget that the most important part of the stethoscope is the part between the earpieces. And I actually said out loud, I didn't get that piece. It's not my box. It was meant to be, it wasn't meant to be a joke. I just thought that I was missing something from my new Littman stethoscope. Actually, Dr. Locke didn't ever touch patients much. He always did, he was very influenced by a man by the name of Alexander Luria, who wrote a fantastic book called Higher Cortical Functions in Man. And Luria was of the opinion that everything that you needed could happen just by watching the patient at the time of history. Simeon used to say that if you don't know what's going on, even in a complex case, in the first 5 minutes, the likelihood that you'll ever know is low. And that more importantly, you can examine all you want, but at the end of the day, the ability to observe exactly what's in front of your face without tapping on a tendon is probably more powerful diagnostically than anything. He was quite stunning to watch in action, by the way. Will you contrast the singular voice of Houston Merritt and the voices of Adams and Victor? I never knew Dr. Merritt himself. The Merritt textbook, of course, I've read. I've only read Adams and Victor in the second edition because the later editions start getting very, in my opinion, Baroque. I love Marty, and I love Alan Roper, and I love Josh Klein, and I love Shashank Prasad, all the people who became editors of later editions of Adams and Victor. Adams and Victor as a book by basically those two guys, and maybe mainly Ray, I don't know. But it's a very different voice than what you read in Merritt. Merritt is I don't know if it was a difference between New York and Boston. I have no idea. But to read Merritt on neurology and to read Adams and Victor on neurology are two different kind of experiences. I'm Boston trained, so obviously I'm very influenced by the ombre, as the French would say, by the shadow of Adams. So I will have to recuse myself from speaking about Merritt, although I have read that textbook. But to this day, I still hear Ray Adams' book in my head except for what he did not like psychiatry. He was not a psychiatry fan, and the last 125 pages of that second edition is really a complete diss of psychiatry, but that's okay. And I think those are the questions that I see in the chat box.
Yeah, I'll open the floor to anyone else. I will say, Ed, one of the things that you said about being immersed in literature, being immersed in reading, I think it's so interesting, especially being immersed in literature that's not the scientific literature, being immersed in all of the other facets of literature, whether it be fiction and nonfiction. I think it's so important, especially so that we don't become isolated and we don't stop growing as a field, because it's so important both as humans, but also in creating new disciplines. The threat of silos is something that I feel, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about them too.
Well, it's pretty straightforward. I think the line that comes to my mind is by a great poet by the name of Elizabeth Bishop. And her great line is the very start of a poem. She says, being a Baptist, comma, believed in total immersion. I just love that line. Being a Baptist, she believed in total immersion. I mean, to really read literature is immersive. And I think that's what I learned from that failure of a year in graduate school. I mean, I read a lot. Now, my reading has changed over the years. I read much differently than I did. So I reread Lear for this talk just to make sure I knew sort of what I was talking about. And I don't read the same way anymore. I'm going to those things that I think are important to me. I couldn't remember whether it was Albany who dies first or Cornwall. And yeah, I always got confused between Edgar and Edmund and all these things. But that doesn't matter to me. That's not why I read Lear. I read Lear at the age of 67 now because I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get old. And that's the reason why I read Lear. That's my immersion into Lear. And you say, okay, I'm going to read. I'm going to immerse myself in that. You don't do that unless you really there's a question that burns. You want to understand something. That's the reason why we read neurology, right? You really want to understand. If you really want to understand the blood-brain barrier, then you're really going to read. You're going to immerse and try to get it and understand it in a way. And you might even go to the bench if you have scientific inclinations. That's how far we immerse ourselves. And as clinicians, I think, you just wait when you're an attending and you make a mistake, you're going to immerse yourself. You're going to immerse yourself and figure out why you made that mistake. And that is fine because all of us make mistakes. I make mistakes every damn day. And the by far the most important thing, the reason for the immersion is not because you're a Baptist, but because you believe in that total immersion as a way to educate yourself, which is why I think people are drawn to reading books outside of neurology, because I think you get that sense more when you're reading a Proust, for example, than reading the latest article out of, I don't know, movement disorders. I don't feel that way about a lot of the articles that I read in movement disorders or in a lot of our literature. I must say the exception is Brain. I still think that Brain publishes our best stuff and in the field, and that's my own personal bias. I'm sure that people will have different opinions about that, but that you asked me, so that's my answer.
Right. Does anyone have any questions or comments that they would like to share?
I don't see that she's on here anymore, but I wanted to just personally thank Jean for clicking in. I don't know if she's still on board or not, but she might have signed off. But Jean Bloom is an incredible woman, a PhD historian, Barnard College, has been incredibly gracious to me over my lifetime. So I was very happy that she came in just for a little bit. And my wife is on this. One of the first times she's heard me give a neurological lecture, I think. But I'm very grateful for that. So thank you all.
Well, thank you, Ed. That was, oh, there may be a question. Let's see.
Of course, yeah. It's
Oh,
not in the
it's
chat that I
Galina. I was
see.
waiting to let someone else have a go, but if you don't mind, I do have one question for you,
Of
Ed.
course.
This is a slight deviation from what you were talking about, but I'm curious about the depiction of neurological conditions in literature. And I remember stumbling upon it, unexpectedly, and then speaking of immersing yourself, then once I stumbled upon the depiction of a neurological condition, the Count of Monte Cristo, I then went and went down an entire rabbit hole of like other conditions that were depicted in fiction and people's thoughts about what the conditions were. And just like I said, there's a whole array of that. But I'm curious, as a reader and as a neurologist, your thoughts on that.
Well, this ground has been plowed in the past. I'll tell you a story about this. Um, Tom Walsh, for those who work at the Brigham, there are three paintings as you walk into the offices of our department, and those are three paintings by Tom Walsh, who died some years ago. He was a friend and a teacher and sort of a crazy guy, frankly. And he decided rather late in his career that he would go learn Greek. And the reason why is he wanted to read about how Homer described head injury, which happens a great deal in the Iliad, especially, less so in the Odyssey. But and then he wrote a book about it. We had long chats about this. He said, I don't want to write a book because I know I'll go to a university press and I'm going to be completely slammed because I'm not a classicist. I'm not good enough for that. And at that point, he had already had problems with his aortic valve. He had a long-standing aortic valve problem. He would often go into failure. So we had a long chat about this, and I said, it doesn't matter. Just write the damn book. And so he wrote it, and you can see it. It's a very short book put out by Oxford. And I saw some of the reviews that he got, and he was decimated. It was brutal. First of all, your sense of Greek diction is horrible, and you don't get the idea. But the problem was that the reviewers didn't get what he was trying to do. He was trying to get in the original, what was it really like to see brain coming out of somebody's skull? That kind of thing. And I think it's much better in the hands of novelists than doctors, with certain exceptions. And I'll give you one example. The great Rose Dew, one of our neurosurgeons, was describing for me a case that I referred to her with really significant swelling. So she does a hemicraniectomy, and the brain is pouring out into the operative field, and she's just scooping it. And this is Rose Dew talking. You have to know who Rose Dew is to visualize this in your mind's eye, right? She's an incredibly soft-spoken woman, but she's actively showing me how she's scooping this stuff out. She's obviously brilliant, but I'm evading your question. There are many examples of this. I actually think the descriptions of psychological disease are much more compelling than descriptions, for example, of an acute abdomen or head trauma or all the rest. I think when it comes to, if you really want to have a sense of somebody going absolutely nuts, read the end of Anna Karenina. I heartily suggest that, because watching that woman literally go off the rails, and by the way, the ending happens in the train station. I mean, it's that to me is one of those moments where you say, my goodness, that's a description, right? And that's powerful. I don't know if you have that feeling with the Count of Monte Cristo, but that certainly happened for me in reading Anna Karenina. Same kind of thing with Crime and Punishment. The figure of what happens in that. Just the image of those characters in Crime and Punishment really plays to psychological drama in a way that very few authors can achieve.
Absolutely.
Oh, one flew over the, so there's a question about one flew over the cuckoo's nest. Yeah, that's you. Okay.
Just agreeing that some
Yeah, agree.
power
Agree with,
fiction is a literature.
yeah. Which was a Ken Kesey book, right? Ken Kesey wrote the original
Hmm.
book,
Yeah, exactly
right?
right.
Well, thank you for all your attention. I didn't mean to go on this long. I apologize.
Oh, that was a fantastic talk, and I absolutely this was a highlight. And also, I think you also outlined the path forward for the neurohumanities through personal stories and personal accounts, which I think is just wonderful. And you're getting lots of kudos in the chat, so thank you so much. And in closing this, thanks for everyone who came to the talk today. I just wanted to spend a few words for some future treats. So just in a few days, there will be another talk focused on reading um, by Suzanne Coven, who's going to be talking about reading Kafka in the hospital cafeteria, reflections on 70 years of literature and medicine at the MGH. And she's an artist in residence at the MGH. I will say we're happy to share this link. This is not sponsored by us, but it's an event that will be taking place, and I think of interest to many of our patrons. And then we also want to talk about the next event coming on Tuesday, December 10th. We're so excited to have Dr. Dawn Hunter, who will give us a talk about the art of Ramon y Cajal. If anyone doesn't know who Ramon y Cajal is, I would definitely recommend looking him up, because he was a neuroscientist and an artist. So certainly another facet of the neurohumanities. And in closing, I would like to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving and start of holiday season from all of us here. And hope to see you soon. Hope to see you in December. Have a good evening, everyone. And thanks again, Ed, for
Thank you.
leading a wonderful talk today.